10 years. If you've ever built a house, you know it takes about 10 years before the shiny new amenities of your shiny new house start to break down, start to require more than just routine maintenance, start to need to be replaced. Maybe it's a dishwasher or an air conditioner. Maybe a pipe starts to leak that never leaked before. Maybe it's time to replace a few shingles and patch the drywall in the places where the cracks have formed as the foundation has sunk and settled with time. It takes about 10 years for all of the stuff that used to be new and pristine to become old and used. It works that way in cities, too. And while there's no good time to trudge through a global depression, South Bend was fortunate that the financial difficulties set in during exactly the time between the years that South Bend's impressive infrastructure was built and the years that it all started to fall apart. The victim of time, use, and the fickle weather that all of us can relate to in northern Indiana. The Long Depression hadn't come during the years when they needed to build everything, and it hadn't come during the years that they would need to fix everything all over again. And then, just as the economy began to recover, South Bend's infrastructure started to need a little more TLC. Paved roads needed to be repaved, laid pipe needed to be relaid, built bridges needed to be rebuilt. It might seem that maintaining the city should have been easier than building it, but this is seldom the case. Maintenance is necessary and infuriating. It's obnoxious when a road becomes pockmarked, and it's more obnoxious when it's closed for repaving. Maintenance is a tough sell for taxpayers who might understand the 10-year rule in a logical way, but who also feel like they're being ripped off when their tax dollars are repaving a road that they only recently paid to pave in the first place. And when it came to the waterworks, the frustration was even more palpable. South Benders were paying to replace lines of pipe even as the city was still paying interest on the bonds they'd sold to get the original pipes there in the first place. Raising money as a city is always a chore, but it's so much easier when you can promise people paved roads when they've never had a paved road before, running water when they'd never had running water before, a free and quick bridge over a river that replaced a slow and costly ferry ride. 10 years later, the taxpayers were on the hook to pay all over again, just to keep the things they already had. It was an inevitability. It was always an inevitability, and everyone knew it, but that didn't make it any more palatable. By 1878, the maintenance cycle might have been part of the reason that A.N. Thomas left the mayor's seat and then left South Bend altogether in order to start a new life and a new city in Nebraska. It was so much easier to build things than to maintain them. Thomas's abrupt departure left a hole in South Bend's leadership that was about to be filled by a political outsider, a prominent citizen who'd never held public office at any level, the first of its mayors who hadn't known the town before the Civil War, and the first one to come with a degree from Notre Dame. It was a new era in South Bend, and it was going to be led by Mayor Lucius Tong. Hello, and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Hellman, and during this 8-episode series, we're going to dive into the dawn of the city of South Bend, the first 25 years after its incorporation, through the lens of its first 8 mayors. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of all 8 episodes in this series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's jump into the life and times and administration of Lucius Tong, an accountant, lawyer, professor, real estate agent, banker, actor, and bad poet who became mayor of South Bend in 1878. Lucius Tong was born in Carroll, Ohio in 1842. coming from a long line of English roots. His family's original surname had been Tong, but the last two letters of that name were dropped when his great-grandparents sailed across the Atlantic to settle in America. Tong wouldn't arrive in South Bend until 1859 when he enrolled at Notre Dame's commercial department. Tong's first pursuit was bookkeeping, an ideal fit for his orderly mind, one that would point to his later career as a lawyer. Tong was a believer in process, and especially in due process. An anecdote tells that Tong received a detention while at Notre Dame, but that he disagreed with the decision and appealed the matter all the way to Father Sorin's office. The anecdote doesn't tell if he was successful in expunging his punishment. After graduating in 1861 with a commercial degree, Tong converted to Catholicism after a Lutheran upbringing and began his career as a professor of bookkeeping at Notre Dame. It was this career that brought his first fame, and he is most likely to be referenced in earlier South Bend newspapers as Professor Tong. A decade later, Tong graduated from Notre Dame all over again, this time with a law degree, and moving up through a series of academic ranks, first as Dean of the Commercial Faculty, and then adding a second title at the same time, Director of the Law Department. Tong was known for his tireless work ethic, his long hours, and his appetite for business. While serving on campus as the dean of one school and director of another, he opened an office in South Bend to work as an attorney, real estate agent, and fire insurance agent. It was during this time that he also founded the St. Joseph Total Abstinence Society, a Catholic version of the Protestant temperance societies that swept through the nation and through South Bend. During these years, he also married, built a home, and started a family. Sans any real political experience, he'd lean on all of these experiences during his brief mayoral campaign. At the position's core, the mayor was a man who had to wear a lot of hats, and Lucius Tong had a lot of experience changing hats. But Lucius Tong was more than just a left-brained lawyer and bookkeeper. He was also a poet, although I have to be honest with you, he wasn't a very good one. In 1875, Tong recited one of his own works at the annual banquet of the St. Joseph Bar Association, a celebration of the legal profession as a whole, a commentary on the history of common law, and a collection of indecipherable mixed metaphors that were really only included because they fit the man's juvenile rhyme scheme. It's pretty bad, and in the sake of time, I won't be able to read any of it to you, but you should do a Google and check it out yourself. Okay, I'll read some of it. Let strict truth prevail, those times are top sawyers, which can boast of the busiest number of lawyers. For what is enlightenment but common law, just leaving the sword and then taking to jaw? Say, look at those barbarous nations of Moke, as black as a coal though quite ignorant of coke. They haven't got stocks and they haven't got shares. Their bulls are quadrupled and so are their bears. Their law is like Jack's with a very fat porpoise. Harpoon him, then issue a habeas corpus. What does that mean? I have no idea, but I can tell you that the poem goes on like this for quite some time, and that's before he gets into the stanzas that he wrote about each and every member of the Bar Association. Trust me, you don't need to hear those. Okay, maybe just one. Then Alvin Dunbar, who has long done bar, where his honor has never received the least scar. Time watches his chance, sir, but all the world knows it. His mortgage is safe until death shall foreclose it. Anyway, besides his involvement with the Bar Association and his business interests in South Bend, Lucius Tong was largely uninvolved in local politics, never seeking lower offices nor being assigned as a delegate in the city's annual Republican conventions. In 1877, he made an appearance at a council meeting to petition for a pair of lampposts on his street, and this is pretty much his only recorded touchpoint with local politics, until he was announced in the newspapers as a candidate for the Republican mayoral nomination on April 26, 1878. We'll track that race right after the break. An important discovery has been made in the city of South Bend. J.C. Knobloch & Co. have invented a new process in roasting coffee that will prove of great value to our citizens. The superior quality of Knobloch & Co.'s own roasted coffee is admitted by thousands who are now using it in this city. One trial of the self-settler will convince anyone that it is at the head of all coffee. The self-settler is roasted daily and the only fresh roasted coffee in the city, and it's sold only at J.C. Knobloch & Co., located conveniently at 62 West Washington Street. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum. Lucius Tong arrived at a Republican convention to discover a party that was at a bit of a crossroads. Republican leaders still treaded on the hard-earned reputation of Schuyler Colfax, but it was a reputation that didn't carry as much weight as it used to. It had been 5 years since the man sat in the vice president's office. More than a third of South Bend's population was new to the city since Colfax left the White House. Each of the first 4 Republican mayors had been heavily involved in local politics since before the Civil War and well before South Bend was a city. But they were getting older, and in Alexander Napier Thomas's case, they were leaving. Besides that, the city was changing. In 1870, South Bend had an African-American population of just 73. By 1880, there were more than 200, and the South Bend Tribune noted that the African-American population was increasing perceptibly. The city had also experienced a rapid influx of European immigrants from Poland, Sweden, and Hungary. But it wasn't just South Bend that was changing. The nation was changing, and technology was exploding at a pace previously unimaginable. The years surrounding the 1878 mayoral election saw the inventions of the telephone, phonograph, light bulb, and gas-powered engine. Lucius Tong was a new face who came from a new generation, the kind of man who seemed poised to lead his party into the years and decades to come. But the old guard wasn't quite ready to go. Not yet, anyway. Tong's primary opponent at the Republican convention was William Miller, 3rd mayor of South Bend, ready to make another run at it. Politically, the two men were really very similar. Fiscally conservative but centrist Republicans who worked well across party lines. But that's where the similarities ended. Miller was pushing 60. Most of his face covered by a long white beard that covered most of his torso, too. Tong was in his mid-30s, clean-shaven, and was, frankly, ruggedly handsome. The third man on the ballot was George Alward, another one of the established Republicans who'd run for and won a handful of county and city offices since at least 1862. Whether it was Tong's youth, good looks, or the fact that Alward and Miller split the senior citizen vote, Tong emerged victorious from the convention as his party's candidate by a narrow margin, winning 237 votes to Miller's 217 and Alward's 104. Then came the general election, once a foregone conclusion, but now a battle against a suddenly relevant Democratic Party and their mayoral candidate, Dwight Deming. It was a weird election. Deming had been a Republican for most of his public life and had run for different offices several times, never advancing beyond the convention, but always winning some number of loyal votes. When he switched to the Democratic Party, he brought a few of those votes with him, enough to make the final polling close, the closest the Democrats had ever come to seizing the mayor's office. But close only counts in hand grenades and horseshoes, and since the hand grenade wouldn't be invented for another 30 years, back then it was just horseshoes, and definitely not elections. Lucius Tong took 52% of the vote and assumed the mayor's office on May 14, 1878. The most important part of his duties was to oversee a city council the likes of which South Bend hadn't seen in a decade. The council of 1878 was split directly down the middle, and when votes were made on party lines, which they often were, That meant that Tong would be the deciding vote. It was 1867, the last time the council had been similarly divided, and if you'll recall from the first episode in this series, the Republicans responded with some clever and probably underhanded political maneuvering to silence a pair of newly installed Democrats who would later resign their seats in protest and frustration. That was no longer a politically viable option, and anyway, it doesn't seem that it was in Lucius Tong's nonpartisan nature. During his first year in office, he'd cast a lot of deciding votes, 2 of them during his first council meeting. To his credit, in that pair of votes, he established himself as a firmly impartial and bipartisan leader of his city. He broke ties to select a Republican as city engineer and a Democrat as streets commissioner. During his inaugural address at that first meeting, Tong also established himself as even more fiscally conservative than his immediate predecessors. Tong called for a 10% reduction in the salaries of all city government employees, without exception, including his own. The matter was voted on and approved a few days later. In 1878, the mayor of South Bend made $180. Tong also espoused that the city was lacking for a fine city hall that might be the crown jewel of the young South Bend. He backtracked just as quickly as he made the statement, explaining that it was absolutely not the kind of project he would pursue until the city's financial prospectus improved. He also pushed for a bill to suppress the sale of obscene literature within the city limits, and the council passed that bill for him too. It had been a busy first week in office. And then, much like his predecessors, he set to the important work of prosecuting public drunkards. Like the mayor before him, Tong was a teetotaler, one who blamed alcohol for a good chunk of the city's ills. In between trials and sentencings, Tong was made trustee at the St. Joseph County Savings Bank, doubled down on a citywide prohibition against dancing on Sundays, went to court to defend a Native American who'd been bilked out of his land, and convened a relief society to provide aid to Southerners who'd been rocked by a yellow fever epidemic. Much like Alexander Napier Thomas before him, Tong's mentions in the newspaper were most likely to come as a result of his extracurricular pursuits. It's a phenomenon that seems strange today, and one that provided an easy target for political opponents even then, but the truth is that the mayorship was a part-time job, and at $180 per annum, it paid like one. By the end of the 1870s, unskilled factory workers were making nearly twice as much in a year. It would seem fair to expect that Tong would need a second job, but it would be more accurate to say that being mayor was his second job. His first job was as an attorney for hire. So there were the logistics of his personal finances, and then there was the reality of his political agenda. The nation at large was just beginning to crawl out of the Long Depression, and so was South Bend. As a political spendthrift, waiting for the city's tax base to recover, Tong was loath to invest in the kinds of projects that might have taken up big chunks of his time. In short, without money to spend, there just wasn't much to do. By the end of the year, all of that was going to change, and Lucius Tong was going to have to spend money whether he liked it or not. Because when we get back from the break, South Bend is going to burn. Ice! Ice! Beck and Son are fully prepared to furnish the people of South Bend this season with pure, clear ice in any quantities and at lowest rates. All orders thankfully received and will be promptly attended to. Orders left at Lewis Nickel Jr. and Company, located at 119 North Main Street, will receive every attention. Families desiring to be supplied should leave orders now. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum. It was Christmas Eve, 1878, 5 degrees below zero, and with a howling wind making conditions even more miserable. Children had been tucked in, and their parents weren't far behind them. It was 10 p.m., and Christmas was just 2 hours away. That's when the dull red glare was first spotted in the second and third story windows over Gillen's restaurant near the corner of Main and Washington Streets. The shrieks of fire came first, followed closely by the clanging of the fire bell. Firemen arrived quickly, but by the time they were on the scene, the flames had begun to spread, eventually claiming 6 buildings and swallowing whole businesses with it, including the restaurant, a grocery, a photography studio, a dentist's office, and a pair of cigar factories. Firemen worked through the night in the frigid conditions, intermittently discovering that their hands had frozen to the nozzles of the hoses they were directing. But then these were the lucky ones. Firefighter Frank Biddle had gotten too close to the flow of water, and after standing in one place for too long, he found himself frozen to the roof of a building where he had to be chopped loose by the axes of his comrades. It was chaos on the ground as the clock ticked toward 4 a.m. Helpful bystanders returned with rifles and shotguns, eager to help in any way that they could. Isaac Steely and Manly Andrews took their spots on the ground below, leveled their rifles, and began shooting toward the flames, shattering upstairs windows so that firefighters could direct their spray directly into the conflagration. J.D. and James Oliver dashed back and forth between the fiery scene and their own factory, delivering new hoses, buckets, and anything else they could find that might help the frozen and exhausted fire crew. By 7 a.m, the fire had been extinguished. It had taken 9 hours. The sun would rise soon. Firefighters had worked through the night. But it was the flames that took the victory, decimating those 6 buildings, ruining the entire block, but claiming no lives. The destruction might have felt total, but South Benders took relief in knowing that without the city's waterworks, it would have been much, much worse. Council members, newspapers, and civilians renewed calls to make sure that this vital infrastructure was maintained and improved. When Notre Dame burned to the ground 4 months later, those calls became cries, and Tong would have to cast his spendthrift nature aside, replacing pipes, improving water delivery systems, and leading the charge for a new pump house. It was a required measure, but it wasn't a popular one, even among those who recognized the necessity of the thing. After all, the city was still paying that interest on the bonds that provided for the original construction of the waterworks. By the end of the year, the new pipes had been paid for, and the old ones had been left in the dump, but the city was still paying for those. And then there was the need to do something about the place those pipes had most likely been dumped. In 1879, on the east side of the river, the city's limits met their southern terminus at Wayne Street. The place where Howard Park is now was not in South Bend, but it ran right up against South Bend, and the place was a dump, literally. It was a headache for South Bend to have a dump right across the street, but since the land was outside of their jurisdiction, there was nothing they could do about it, unless they were willing to buy it. So that's what they had to do, acquiring the place called Hex Addition for $60 a lot and making plans to transform the mosquito-infested dump into a city park. Lucius Tong even purchased one of the lots from his own purse and donated it to the city. They planted a few trees, but money was a finite resource, and Tong had already spent more than he wanted to. It would be another 20 years before Howard Park opened. The city might have hoped to build a park. Instead, they'd just acquired a dump. The financial hits kept coming. Shoddy roads needed reworked, and Tong set on to the largest repaving project in the history of the city. In October 1879, the Jefferson Street Bridge was condemned and a new one recommended. Tong seems to have been convinced of the validity of these projects, and it wouldn't have mattered if he didn't. The city council elections of 1879 turned that body decidedly Democratic. Tong's opinion had been diminished, and his tie-breaking vote was no longer needed. Fortunately, South Bend was in the midst of a return to prominence, and for the first time in a while, its financial forecast was pointing in the right direction. From the ashes of the Christmas Eve fire had risen the Oliver House, a fine hotel named in honor of the Olivers, but not built by them. The Oliver House should not be confused with the Oliver Hotel, a grand construction project that was still several years away. In September 1879, President Rutherford B. Hayes made a whistle stop in South Bend, the first sitting president to step foot in the city. Lucius Tong welcomed him matter-of-factly, saying, "Mr. President, I take pleasure in welcoming you to the busy manufacturing city of South Bend." A lightning strike at his own barn notwithstanding, Tong had gotten through the year better than could have been imagined, working so well with the Democrats that the Herald, the city's Democratic newspaper, even began to sing his praises. Tong continued to run a tight ship and gained cooperation from a Democratic council who agreed to aggressively rein in spending in most areas, while making sure Tong was willing to fully fund the improvements and maintenance projects the city needed. In November of 1879, Tong even performed the role of Judge Starley in a production of Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers, earning bipartisan esteem for his acting chops, which were hopefully better than his poetry skills. The paper spoke highly of Tong's tenure as mayor, boasting that the signature accomplishment of his administration was, and I quote, "the great amount of routine business disposed of in a given time." It might seem like kind of a milquetoast compliment, but it's one the straightforward and businesslike Lucius Tong would have appreciated. In January 1880, ahead of a new election cycle, Tong recommended that the city become a subscriber to a newfangled device called the telephone. Initially, there were 40 individuals signed up for connectivity, and with the ringing of the fire bell still in his ears, Tong recognized an opportunity to better equip the city's emergency response. In a forward-thinking move, Tong led the push to get telephones installed in every fire station in the city. It was a popular move, one of many during his term that made Tong a popular mayor, despite the difficult circumstances he'd faced. That April, the Herald, which I must remind you was a Democratic newspaper, ran another article about Lucius Tong saying, "He has been wholly nonpartisan, and he has maintained a character officially and unofficially void of offense toward God and man." The paper openly wished that they could run Tong as the mayoral candidate on the Democratic ticket, but said that they would settle for endorsing him for the mayor's office anyway. They espoused that the Democratic Party would be unable to produce a single candidate who could run against him. Tong, of course, received the endorsement of the Republican newspapers, and in a weird bipartisan love fest, the Republican Tribune even endorsed a few Democrats for the Water Commission. Lucius Tong won the Republican primary unopposed, held endorsements from the Democratic and Republican newspapers, and with 2 weeks to go before the general election, there wasn't even a Democratic mayoral candidate on the ballot. He was popular, supported, and unopposed. That's what makes this next part so weird, because Tong lost. The Democratic convention put forward Dr. Levi Ham as their mayoral candidate just a few days before the election. Ham was at that time a 75-year-old doctor who hadn't held a public office of any kind since he was a member of the state senate in Maine all the way back in the 1830s. Ham's first political career had ended before Tong was even born. Before accepting the nomination, Ham attempted to decline it at least twice, demurring that he did not particularly want the job. In 1866, an article in the St. Joseph Valley Register alleged that Ham had avowed that he would have voted for the devil before he voted for Abraham Lincoln. That very same Dr. Ham didn't just beat Tong in the election. He trounced him, winning by 10 points and some 250 votes, much to the shock of the Republican and Democratic elites, but maybe not to the surprise of the people on the ground. We'll get into the myriad reasons for Ham's win in the next episode, but for now, just know that the Republicans were left licking their wounds. They were very nearly swept at the polls, taking exactly one city council seat, and that was it. The Tribune the next day did not show restraint, writing, "It's a poor day for Republican roosters. Figures won't lie. We have been worsted, whipped, most outrageously wailed. Sitting down on the business end of attack couldn't make Republicans feel any worse. If St. Jacob's Oil relieves pain, the druggists should have a big Republican patronage. We Republicans know about how the French army felt at Sedan. The South Bend Democrats yesterday were men who move in a mysterious way their political wonders to perform. Many Republicans find this a splendid day to go fishing. Lucius Tong was never again a candidate for public office and was made vice president at the St. Joseph County Savings Bank shortly after abdicating office. He left Notre Dame's full-time faculty a year later and bounced between several prominent South Bend companies, including roles at the St. Joseph Loan and Trust Company, South Bend Clearinghouse Association, and Coquillard Wagon Works. He held all three of those jobs at once when he suffered a nervous breakdown in the aftermath of the financial panic of 1907. Lucius Tong died on April 12, 1908. Every bank in South Bend closed in honor of his memory. He is buried in the Cedar Grove Cemetery. Tong was remembered for his intimidating work ethic, his nonpartisan nature, and of course, his poetry. I'll leave you with just one more stanza. And then there is grave Tut, who on forum or farm succeeds in all things, as you know, to a charm. Agriculture and law he knows how to adorn, forcing judges in both to acknowledge the corn. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Hellman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. Our next episode will pick up where this one left off, with South Bend's 6th mayor and its first Democrat, Dr. Levi Ham, and I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.